Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for making time to be here. I'm very excited to be here as well to listen to wonderful Dr. Terry Wotherspoon. And I'll just start by a brief introduction, and then I'll hand over the floor to you, and then quietly listen, hopefully. So I'm honored to introduce Dr. Wotherspoon, a professor of sociology at the University of Saskatchewan. As a distinguished and established scholar, Dr. Wotherspoon has published widely on issues related to education reform, teachers' work, social policy, inequality, and Indigenous settler relations in Canada. He has also presented on and published about the criminal justice system, the Canadian welfare system, immigration, family, migration, and citizenship. Dr. Wotherspoon has authored 22 refereed articles, 57 chapters, 3 books, including The Sociology of Education in Canada, and co-authored book, The Legacy of School for Aboriginal People Education, Oppression, and Emancipation. His research has been funded by SSHRC, as well as by Saskatchewan Learning, the Ladler Foundation, and Perry Center of Excellence for Research on Immigration and Integration, along with, of course, funding from numerous other agencies and organizations. In addition to Dr. Wotherspoon's countless service roles and responsibilities at the University of Saskatchewan and in the broader community, he has also served as the managing editor of Canadian Review of Sociology, a thankless and daunting work, and the president of Canadian Sociological Association. As a professor, Dr. Wotherspoon has a wonderful track record of being a great mentor and advisor to numerous sociology undergraduate and graduate students. And his extensive contributions has been recognized through awards, including the Canadian Education Association's Whitworth Award for Educational Research, the Canadian Association of Foundations for Education Book Award, and Canadian Sociological Association's Outstanding Service Award. More recently, in recognition of all of this that I've talked about, Dr. Wotherspoon's outstanding work, he's also been awarded the 2021 CSA Outstanding Contribution Award. As demonstrated through his extensive work and service to the community, Dr. Wotherspoon is a true advocate and ambassador of Canadian sociology, and I'm honored to introduce him today. So with that, please welcome me in joining Dr. Terry Wotherspoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Irene. Thank you for that introduction. And before I start, I would like to acknowledge that I'm presenting to you today from Treaty 6 territory in the homeland of the Métis. And I'd like to use this opportunity to all reflect on and honor on an ongoing basis the relationships and the obligations which this entails, wherever we happen to be located today. I'm going to move now into sharing my screen. And I first want to say that a few months ago, when I was asked to provide a title on an abstract, I thought I'd come up with something that was a bit catchy and maybe would attract people. And then when I started working on this presentation, I thought, gee, I was pretty stupid. This covers a lot of ground, and a lot of the work has already been done. So what really is there new to say about some of these issues? So today I know that some of you will be familiar with some of the data that I'm going to share and some of the issues that I'm going to talk about, but hopefully I'll be able to put the pieces together in a way that will be meaningful and allow people to reflect on certain aspects of education and what it means in Canada today. I'm going to begin by going way back in time, even before my day. In his landmark work published in 1965, The Vertical Mosaic, John Porter lamented the dismal performance of Canada's education systems. And he highlighted in particular the limited concern to address social mobility, which he associated in turn with the national failure to advance the commitment to a kind of democratic and socially just social structure that he saw as being essential for an advanced industrial order. Today, of course, 6 decades later almost, Canada has come to be recognized as a highly educated society, as well as a nation that is exemplary in some cases, given its focus on diversity, respect, and social justice. And as part of this, there's been a growing number of allusions over the past decade or so to the idea that Canada has actually become the new home of the American dream. So in this talk, I want to explore at a relatively high level some of the dimensions associated with the discourse, along with an alternative discourse and orientation focused on the emergence of what's come to be called the new inequality, with reference to some of the most significant trends in educational and social policy since the time of the vertical mosaic. And I'll conclude by observing that, of course, there's some evidence to support both stances, but more significantly, the public embracement of these kinds of discourses speaks to some more unsettling fundamental truths about the nature and character of contemporary Canadian society. So looking first at what has changed, first of all, Canada has come to be viewed as one of the best educated, if not the best educated nations in the world. As this figure illustrates, about 60% of Canadians ages 25 to 64 today hold post-secondary credentials. The black line on the left is Canada, which is above the reported levels for all of the other nations reported here, as well as above both the OECD and G20 averages, which are the lighter shaded lines towards the right of the chart, the graph. With respect to the other side of what Porter was talking about, the changing national narrative, the national narrative has also changed significantly since Porter's day. Just switch back here for a second. The story of Canada, of course, is that Porter conducted his analysis at a time when education and other institutional structures revolved around what was recognized as the two founding people or charter groups of English or French. Shortly after Porter wrote his work, of course, within the next couple of decades, the adoption of policies of multiculturalism broadened the national identity to embrace a much more open and accepting stance, which has in recent years been identified as the Canadian exceptionalism in a context in which tighter immigration controls and xenophobia have characterized many other Western democracies. And of course, even more recently, in response to the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the official national story is once again shifting to highlight the experiences and place of Indigenous people within what is now Canada, in accordance with calls to move towards a new relationship based on mutual respect and recognition. So as these developments have unfolded, as I mentioned earlier, I've been really intrigued by the increasing adoption, especially over the past 10 years or so, of discourses associated with the notion that Canada has become the new host or place where the American dream can be fulfilled. This discourse has been spreading across a number of different media and related commentary in Canada, across the US and beyond. And it's been really exploding in recent years in a number of ways and a number of regards. You can even buy the merchandise, and it's also infiltrated the world of the global sporting world. So it's a very powerful discourse. And of course, what is behind this? Well, there's several factors and there's several variants and sources. It's not a unified discourse, but it first gained attention in conjunction with economic analysis in Canada, in particular the work of Miles Korak and his associates who began to use that terminology. In the US, other economists like Reg Chetty and others, this discourse then gained traction in popular media and news outlets, all of which has been picked up and promoted more fully by other sources, including immigration consultants. The focus, the main elements of this discourse have focused on differences between intergenerational mobility in Canada and the US, which figures prominently in the initial analysis that gave rise to these discourses. And then along with that, a number of associated factors, including the acceptance of immigrants related to the imagery of Canadian exceptionalism that I talked about earlier, the opportunities available to us attain post-secondary credentials for international as well as domestic students, pathways to employment after graduation and expanding pathways to citizenship for international students, as well as a wide range of favorable employment-related benefits and public services, including a strong public education system supported by funding arrangements that allow, unlike some places, for somewhat equitable distribution, at least, of basic educational resources, as well as a tax and transfer system that helps to mitigate the extreme dimensions of market inequality. Along with this has been that second discourse, the new inequality. The notion of the new inequality, of course, focuses on growing income polarization, both within nations as well as on a global basis. And many of you are familiar with this, no doubt. The concept began appearing in economic analysis in the US, including a book by that name by R.B. Freeman at the end of the 1990s, subsequently gained a much higher global profile in conjunction with the work of French economist Thomas Piketty, via the notion of the 1%. All of these have focused on the reversal of post-World War II trends towards greater income equality as global economic globalization, deregulation, increased marketization across domains, and welfare structuring have posed new risks for the least well-off and greater opportunities for those at the top. The evidence for these trends in Canada has been demonstrated by several analysts, including, again, the ongoing work by Miles Korak and associates, as well as Keith Banting and Robert Miles and many others as well. And as related inequalities extend across two major life spheres, such as health conditions, living conditions, and overall well-being. To address these issues, of course, there's been extensive analysis done across many spheres. A lot of regressions have been sacrificed in the process, with the general finding that, well, it's complex, but there's been a tendency towards growing inequality and reduced mobility, even in Canada, related to job polarization and the hollowing out of the middle, along with broader dynamics that have played a role in this, including policy changes. Education, of course, has played a mixed role in all of this, and policy changes related to education have been part of that as well. Education has been able to mitigate some of the impact of the worst fallbacks, but it's also responsible for holding back opportunities and prospects for many individuals and groups. Over time, and I'm going to turn in just a minute to some figures that I know are well known, but I think they're important simply to illustrate what I want to talk about later. The mass expansion of education systems, as Alex Chow and Neil Guppy have demonstrated recently in the CRS, has contributed more to the illusion of mobility than actual fairness in a lot of ways, or the broadening of opportunities themselves. So first of all, the education has grown then across different areas and different aspects of the population. So I want to speak now a little bit about educational change. Several factors have contributed to the emergence of the kind of highly educated population that I showed earlier in this talk. The growth of the education system as a whole, with the massive expansion, the convergence and movement of the baby boom generation, especially through the system at a time when changing labor market demands associated with deindustrialization and the rise of the tertiary sector prompted mass education at higher and higher levels. If you look at universities, at the time that Porter was writing, there were only about 60 universities nationwide, with about 200,000 students enrolled across the nation, to now figures of nearly 1.5 million students in over 300 degree granting institutions, and another 500,000 in numerous colleges and vocational institutes across the country today. Along with this, the latter two trends are things that I want to get back to later in this presentation after I go through a little bit of the data, is that there's been an increasing integration of education into economic and social policy since the early 1990s. In particular, there's also a growing focus on at-risk children and youth, both in the K-12 system, where services are aimed at keeping the groups with the highest dropout rates in school for longer periods of time, and in the post-secondary system, where there's a similar orientation, often captured in strategic enrollment management and related policies and proposals that seek to attract and retain underrepresented student populations and grow their student populations more generally. So let's briefly then just run through some of the trends and patterns and figures. Driving educational expansion in particular has been the increasing educational participation and attainment levels among women associated with changes in family composition, labor force participation, and feminist political mobilization. And this, of course, has also accounted for a substantial amount of the observed intergenerational educational mobility. So you can see here, looking at the proportion of the population for both men and women, that the changes have been especially pronounced where women's enrollment in post-secondary education has increased tremendously here, looking at those with a university degree since the 1960s. At the start of the period, women were much more likely to not go beyond high school than men, and very limited prospects to attain university degrees. Well, at the end of the millennium, the trends have started to reverse, and you see that both in terms of high school attainment and university attainment, then women are outperforming men, which again is well known to most of us anyway. This has also occurred across other groups here. Just looking at the Indigenous population, for example, you can also see a rising proportion with university degrees over this time period, with steady increases accelerating more recently. At the same time, you may recall that Porter talked about the reliance on immigration rather than domestic education. Immigration continues to remain important for elevating the overall educational attainment levels among the Canadian population. Here, the data are shown for a smaller age range, 25 to 44, within the working age population, and they reveal that while increasing proportions of the Canadian-born population, the lighter shaded area on the right, are attaining university overall. These levels continue to be several percentage points below the university educated immigrant population, of course, reflecting the increasing centrality of immigration continuing within strategies to ensure a highly qualified workforce. At the same time, of course, many immigrants, once they arrive through a highly selective process, are still left to their own devices, and it's well established that the return on education tends to be much lower for immigrants than for non-immigrants, especially among selected groups. Overall, then, this demonstrates that education matters. Rising educational levels across nearly all segments of the population are given further impetus as people are aware of the strong association between educational attainment success and enhanced prospects for success within labor markets. Well, the advantages of having a higher education extends well beyond economic factors into other domains, such as health, well-being, standards of living, life environments, community relationships, and capacity to engage successfully across a number of spheres of social activity. And at the same time, while differential education levels contribute to the social inequality observed, there's also solid, consistent evidence that education can help to mitigate social inequality as long as certain conditions are in place. International comparative research demonstrates consistently, repeatedly, that the prospects for socioeconomic outcomes within nations and region are higher as long as there's a well-funded public education system, neighborhood diversity, which plays a role in reducing segregation across social and economic groups, and a comprehensive and relatively open post-secondary education system. These factors, of course, are especially important in elevating the bottom in terms of improving educational participation and attainment levels, fostering opportunities for mobility, and tempering polarization. Let's turn now to look at some of these trends in a little bit more detail, revisiting some of the figures that I showed earlier. First of all, let's go back to that first slide where you saw that Canada overall had a higher proportion of the population with tertiary credentials. You break this down now with regard to university degrees versus college certification, a slightly different picture emerges. With respect to university degree holders now, Canada is situated closer to the middle of the pack and only slightly above the OECD average. This has, of course, mixed significance. On the one hand, the expansion of the college system has presented opportunities for underrepresented groups to attain post-secondary education, in the process linked with solid employment prospects and other factors that they are able to benefit from through the skills and qualifications they generate through college programs. At the same time, of course, a lot of these programs and options associated with college tend to be less stable, especially when they're linked to employment sectors or occupations that are vulnerable to technological restructuring or economic volatility. University rate participation rates are also increasing, of course, and they're also relatively high, but they continue to be much more selective. And parental income and education, along with urban residence, are among the strongest determinants of participation, and university attainment continues to be selective, a number of other dimensions as well. So illustrating with respect to a couple of the other patterns, if you look at the non-Indigenous versus the Indigenous population now, as you saw, the Indigenous education levels were rising overall, but here you begin to see that that at the same time, they're increasing less than comparable levels for the non-Indigenous population in the top bar. Looking a little bit more detail at this, if you look at now college and university certification, as I said earlier, college certification provides opportunities for many underrepresented groups. And you can see this here. I've taken immigrants out so that you get for this period, so that you get a greater comparison within the Canadian-born population, that you see that college certification remains relatively high among the Indigenous population, while with respect to those with university degrees, although the rates of growth have been higher for Indigenous populations, the absolute level and the absolute difference has actually increased over time, as illustrated in the figure before, but now also looking just at the younger end of that age cohort. Let's then look at the other end of the education distribution, those people with less educational credentials. Here, looking at those with less than high school or at least no more than high school. Again, here we're looking at the a different segment here. Those are those aged 25 to 34 are illustrated in this slide. You can see that while most people are making it through high school, the prospects vary considerably based on a number of factors, including race, in particular for Indigenous people and the Canadian-born Black youth population, particularly if they're male. But other factors also are important, including being a lone parent, those reporting a disability, and of course, the interaction among these factors makes the likelihood of not completing high school even higher for many children and youth and young adults. Looking even lower, those who are not in education, employment, or training, who have not continued beyond high school or not completed high school at all. Where are they? Well, looking at the population ages 15 to 24, in this case comparing Canada, the US, and the OECD, you can see that well, generally, Canada is performing better than the US in this regard. It's striking that except for females aged 20 to 24, non-participation levels in Canada are above the OECD average. So we have this polarized education system or structure where you do have a lot of people getting high credentials, but a lot of people not getting credentials as well. And of course, from a policy perspective, these trends are very well known, and the attention to the kinds of patterns that we've observed here give rise to an orientation, both in Canada and internationally, to a focus on equity and inclusion on the one hand, and to performance and excellence on the other hand, associated with objectives to boost economic growth and address demographic change. These concerns, at the same time, have paralleled a broader policy focus, which, as noted earlier, has come to integrate social policy with economic policy and bringing education more fully within the domains encompassed by these policy fields. Well, this echoes earlier human capital orientations. There's a difference in that there's a more consistent focus on changing and upgrading the skill repertoire across the population and ensuring that virtually all people, and especially those at the margins and left out of economic participation, are employable, as the term goes, as citizen rights increasingly come to be linked with labor market participation. And as these policy shifts play out, they're also conveyed in a number of different ways and different terms, illustrated here with reference to what the OECD has framed as transformative competencies that are oriented to 3 dimensions in particular. Number 1, here's the economic, creating new value. Number 2, to reconcile tensions and dilemmas. And number 3, make people take responsibility. And in social policy terms, these are very much compatible with what's generally referred to as a social investment welfare state, which in contrast to post-World War II welfare state orientations, which have focused on decommodifying, shielding people from the risks of the labor market in certain ways, or protecting people from vulnerabilities, has focused on commodification, where all people are supposedly enabled to gain the skills and capacities to sustain themselves through labor market participation. The focus in this is on early childhood and education, along with training and household work relationships to allow all household members to enter the labor market either now or in the near future. Though compatible, of course, with many features of neoliberalism, proponents have highlighted a distinction between this approach, the social investment model, and neoliberalism, insofar as the state retains an important role within this welfare training mix. The goal, as Anthony Giddens, and here this is the social policy hat Anthony Giddens, not the sociologist Anthony Giddens speaking, although it's the same person, is to ensure that individuals are enabled to become responsible risk takers, in his word, to address continuous change and uncertainty accelerated within late modernity. This reframing of social and economic policy is couched in discourses highlighting notions such as individual rights, fairness, initiative, entrepreneurship, solidarity, and so on. And this is where we come back to this notion of the American dream and the whole focus on mobility versus polarization. There's an emphasis on discourses related to socioeconomic stratification and mobility, which, although they are important for highlighting important aspects of inequality, they also tend to draw attention away from more fundamental problems concerning the structure of inequality and the practices that reinforce these inequalities, posing barriers for large segments of the population. Social life in this way can be seen almost as a kind of competition in which individual ambition, along with adherence to notions of fairness and equality of opportunity, become the hallmarks of one's destiny. At the same time, in many respects, commitments to democracy, liberalism, and fairness remain more formal than substantive. In schools and other institutions, there have been many genuine initiatives, especially to support students from relatively low-performing groups experiencing difficult circumstances or encountering other forms of exclusion. But in many cases, these have been more performative or superficial rather than able to sustain the deep and complex attention to human experiences and needs and meaningful relationships that really are essential if they're to be effective. Equity in this regard, in many significant respects, is squeezed aside by efforts to deliver on priorities that are focused on competition, assessment, performance, and efficiency. And of course, there's a tremendous amount of research in the sociology of education exploring this. In schools, for example, as my research with Emily Milne on schooling and reconciliation has revealed with respect to Indigenous students and perspectives, or as shown in the work of many researchers exploring the educational experiences of Black youth in Toronto and elsewhere, schooling practices and the guiding assumptions that they work within continue to play out in ways that limit prospects for children, not just to get an education, but to gain confidence in their identities and roots, preventing many children and youth, especially from minoritized populations, from establishing the solid foundation they need that's essential for being able to achieve their educational and social aspirations, whatever these happen to be. Many of these structures and practices, and since I referred to racialization, I refer here to especially what Francis Henry and Carol Tater have called democratic racism, or with more specific reference to Canada's status as a settler colonial society, represents a sort of democratic colonialism in which dominant frameworks and liberal perspectives serve as ways both to maintain and conceal, at least to some extent, the racialization, stigmatization, and suppression of Indigenous people and other racialized minorities. But several other kinds of barriers, of course, also exist to limit people's educational development and advancement. For example, despite the tremendous gains that women have made in educational attainment, in recent years, they've been more likely to report than men that they've encountered obstacles preventing them from achieving their desired levels of education. While education funding remains relatively high in Canada, the changes that are taking place reveal that the numbers of pupils per teacher in Canada at both elementary and secondary school levels are much higher than in most other comparable nations. And recent funding constraints have contributed to further restrictions in the number of teachers, especially in educational assistants in many school districts. In the process, this puts pressures on teachers and education support staff, which compound the likelihood that the focus on excellence or high performance, which can be delivered in standardized test results, will take priority with the harder work involved in ensuring that equity considerations are achieved. These factors become even more significant when you take into account the broader, more constrained opportunity structure associated with longer-term contradictions within advanced capitalism. Education and labor markets, among other spheres of activity, are distinct fields that remain out of sync with one another given the dynamic nature of economic structures, jobs, and labor market needs. There will never be a perfect fit. And of course, these problems are the focus of a long line of analysis within the sociology of education, from Randall Collins's work on credential inflation, Bourdieu on structural de-skilling and the race for educational qualifications, Philip Brown on the opportunity trap, and many others. In other words, as educational qualifications, even if they're not essential for or directly related to qualifications and skills needed to perform particular jobs, as these rise ever higher, there's even a further impetus to augment levels of training and credentials in response to competition for jobs or an absence of employment opportunities. Students under these pressures are encountering intense pressure to perform or to deal with the consequences of being unable to achieve expected performance or outcome levels. The COVID-19 pandemic, of course, has even more fully exacerbated these problems and education-related inequalities and stress points more fully. One major manifestation of this, of course, is what's been called the crisis of mental health among youth. And it's interesting that these are observed especially among the top and the bottom ends of the socioeconomic and educational population distributions. But the impact of these developments, of course, extends well beyond health and socioeconomic consequences to encompass many other spheres of daily life, including the increasing frequency and expression of racism, the appropriation and distortion of discourses related to rights, freedoms, and other principles, and resistance to many of the kinds of initiatives advanced in the name of equity, which are dismissed as a form of privileged or special treatment extended to specific minorities, all of which have opened the door more widely for political disaffection, more frequently evident in variants of right populism, anti-democratic mobilization, and authoritarian tendencies that until recently have remained at least relatively subdued or only building slowly within the Canadian context. Finally, then, what does all of this say about Porter's vision and how far we've come towards realizing the vision that Porter put forward? Well, certainly the broad commitments to fairness, justice, equality remain very strong. Policies associated with immigration, reconciliation, reinforced by improvements in the quality of education, whatever their shortcomings, stand along with other policies as evidence of some of the kinds of progressive experimentation that was advocated by Porter. At the same time, there's strong evidence that new forms of inequality are emerging along with the so-called perpetuation of the so-called older inequality based on class, race, gender in particular, although the interactions and the intersections within these forms of inequality, of course, become much more complex in nature and much more intertwined in a number of different ways. With respect to the desire for renewed relations between indigenous and non-indigenous people, this focus on individuation, competitive pressure, and ranking reinforce what Marie Baptiste names as cognitive imperialism, all of which are antithetical to advancing decolonization. In short, although Canada is in many ways a very different place from what was seen in Porter's day, it's still one in which individuals and families are tasked with negotiating their way through significant risks, uncertainties, and barriers, all of which are constituted, interpreted, and experienced in highly uneven and unequal ways. Stop.
Thank you so much, Terry. I found that fascinating, especially your I kept thinking about the American dream and the discourse of American dream and how that's conceptualized in this in a Canadian context. So I'm going to open it up to questions from the attendees. And before I do, just do this one question that came up during your presentation, and that was from the slide. I can't remember what slide it was, but it was about 13 minutes, 24 timestamp, and it was regarding the definition of disability and how disability was being defined. And I was wondering if you could speak to that well, and then we can have other questions coming up.
Yeah, these are Statistics Canada data, and these are based on self-reported disability, and the data collect in this particular study, which was the most recent major national study done now, I think 2017. They identified moderate, mild, moderate, and extreme disability. I don't remember the specific guidelines they used, but you know, it related to certain types of functionality and performance that was given. So I selected the data that I presented represent all of the above in a sense. I was going to use mild disability, but there wasn't a lot of difference between mild and moderate disability in those data.
Thank you, Terry. One of the other questions that you that I have was, as we're going through about the new inequality, and I was wondering just the discourse of the new inequality. Is it new, or is it just and how is it new, or has it always been there where certain people were more likely to go into graduate school and post-secondary overall, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The origins of the discourse come from economic analysis, where they're actually looking at that's defined in terms of the Gini coefficient, in terms of the distribution of wealth and income across the population. And the reason it's called the new inequality is because there has been a trend through much of the 20th century of declining inequality based on these data. Of course, they don't always, they're not entirely, they don't capture all of the inequalities because they don't capture wealth, for example, and corporate holdings and, holdings that are hidden outside of the tax system because they're based on tax filing and other publicly available or other available data sources. But it's called the new inequality because you saw this reversal of this overall trend to declining inequality. And so there's really kind of a U-shaped curve that you start to see. So that's where the idea of the new inequality emerges. And of course, this became, much of the focus around the protests that emerged earlier in the 21st century around income polarization and the 99% versus the 1%ers. And so it was new in the sense that the attention was drawn globally towards this inequality and level. A lot of this really depends also on how historically you go. If there was anyone here that was looking for a deep dive into the data, I disappointed you today, I know, because there's a lot of deep data and a lot of nuances within the data. But if you go back, for example, several centuries, and there are websites that monitor this and groups, that the standard of living across the globe is increasing, and some of the most severe inequalities are decreasing along with that. Of course, because as the bottom elevates, then you find that there's some impetus to move in that direction. But within that, of course, the massive holdings are vast within particular groups. If you look at the discourse in the literature on the so-called new inequality, even if you look at, who are the top 10% or even who are the top 1% in Canada, which Korak and others have looked at, you find that, there's not that many ultra billionaires, right, in the Canadian context. And so the top 1% actually goes quite far down the income distribution. So there's a lot of people who are employed, medical doctors, for example, dentists and others would be within that group as well. So it's not just the corporate elite that are part of this. And I mean, this is quite fascinated when you go back to Porter's work and then the work that it influenced on the idea of the corporate elite. Who are they? We've kind of gotten away from class analysis in Canada a lot, but this is where I haven't done this work myself, but there's a lot of possibilities and prospects to move into that direction, to explore these trends, take some of this away from the economists and look at it from a sociological lens.
Thank you for that, Terry. We have a question from Emily. Emily, if you want to unmute yourself and ask the question, you can.
Sure, thank you. I don't know how to turn on my camera. I don't see that button, so I am here. Thank you for the great presentation, Terry. I put my question in the chat as well, but I was just wondering, you've talked about, some trends that exist as well as some challenges that exist. And I'm just wondering, in your perspective, in your view, I'm wondering what you would identify as kind of the priority research areas or even the priority research kind of questions right now, for our social ed friends out there, but also kind of in general related to your topic, like what would you say is the most important area or an important or priority area right now?
Wow. There's a lot of great work. I mean, the sociology of education is really bubbling across Canada. You may not see it kind of on the front lines. A lot of departments, like even my own department, does not teach the sociology of education anymore. But there's a lot of research being done by researchers and graduate students and others, both at a micro level, in the classroom level, and at a macro level. And what I'd really like to see is, without going into any specific area, I'd like to see a little bit more of this. And, this is what I tried to pull together a little bit with this talk, is really looking at some of the prospects for pulling together some of the broader trends, and then, looking at how they're playing out. There's a vast amount of work, on the classroom level and the classroom dynamics and so on. Very, very good stuff, very, very important stuff. It would be nice to see a little bit more of a pulling together of the work that's being done in different ways and in different stages. There's a major SHRC partnership grant project for somebody out there.
Maybe Emily. We have a next question from Terry Ann. Terry Ann, unmute yourself. or maybe the dog wanted to speak as well. Carrie Ann, if you're there, if you want to ask a question. If not, I can see if I can. So this is the question that Terry Ann had. You mentioned an ongoing increasing resistance to movements, policies based on attaining equity for minoritized groups. I draw a connection in the statement to Indigenous post-secondary students who are experiencing consistent and increasing levels of anti-Indigenous racism on post-secondary campuses. So your question is, in light of this, polarization, is this going to lead to a potential lowering of post-secondary completion rate for Indigenous students, which we know, as you mentioned, has numerous connection to wellness. So what is the next step for PSIs?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good question, an important one. I don't know that there'll be a lot of migration away or a lot of reduction. You know, I think the trend is continuing and will likely continue to do so. And you know, there are many Indigenous students who are able to succeed regardless of, you know, the barriers that they might encounter, or regardless of the problems that they see. Some of these are, you know, people are coming out now and advocating. A lot of people that have gone through the education system and are and have seen some of the positive things, but also some of the problems that continue to exist, have become very effective advocates for change and working within. You know, it's driven some people away from, you know, wanting a career as a teacher or as a university professor, you know, where we need more of these people to be involved. But at least it is, you know, a lot of them are going back and working in communities. This has gone back. I mean, the work that Bernard Schizzle and I did a couple of decades ago, where we looked at Indigenous communities, Indigenous education, you know, again, at a time when dropout rates were even higher than they are today. What we found was that all of the children, just about all of the children in Indigenous communities, in this case in Saskatchewan, that we worked with, had very, very high educational aspirations to begin with. But it was partway through that they run into problems where they don't make it through the K-12 system, or if they do and get into post-secondary, they run into problems. Some of those difficulties are still around. Some of them are, you know, are still present. I mean, if you look at the recent Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommendations, a lot of those recommendations were basically recommendations that were picked up on from the earlier Royal Commission on Aboriginal people many years earlier than that. And so, you know, change has been very, very slow, and a lot of areas have continued not to change. But, you know, there's some hope amidst the pessimism and gloom.
I like hope. Hope is good. So Megan had a question about regarding the percentages being calculated from the subpopulation of all ages. So they said that it seems to be pretty low if calculated among the adult population. So I was wondering if you have an answer to that.
I'm not quite sure which data these are referring to. These are all census data. These are all and so they, you know, they're the various slides represent different age cohorts. The 25 to 64, the percentages are going to be lower because you have, you know, the older population is less well educated than the younger population. But then when you begin to look at those earlier or lower age cohorts, the proportions are a little bit higher because you do have rising education across the groups.
Thanks. Jacqueline also has another question, a question about the three major contributors to inequality. So Jacqueline said that the three, I don't know, I'll let you read it if you want. Or would you like me to read it out to you? So I guess the question is, considering the contributions of lack of affordable housing, the frozen welfare rates, and for those in lowest economic groups, and the rising cost of post-secondary education, including the tuition fees, what do you think is going to happen to post-secondary education? Will the trend trend continue or reverse?
That's a really interesting question. As sociologists, we tend not to predict the future, although there are those that one would like a sociology of futures. There's no doubt that that all of these factors are having an impact. I think that what we see now is, at least initially, and this has of course been exacerbated by COVID, is that the enrollment rates have continued to rise. Partly fueled by international students. We are seeing increased competition for international students, and a lot of the nations where the international students are predominantly coming from, China and India in particular, have begun to invest very heavily in both their post-secondary infrastructure, but also in terms of keeping graduates after graduation. And so that's going to have an impact on enrollment. And, this is where the so-called strategic enrollment management plans have come into place in terms of bringing in underrepresented groups, but also addressing those students who might otherwise not complete their education. So there is a progressive development, a progressive element to some of these. What you do see, of course, is that that a four-year degree is more likely a 5 or 6 year degree. A degree in itself is not the be-all end-all, but people are combining it with micro credentials, with college credentials and shorter programs and others. So it's very likely, simply based on the dynamics and simply based on the labor market requirements, that that all of these forces are driving education. It's like a ratchet. It keeps going up and up and up and up. And so even though there are problems, there are financial problems. One of the issues, of course, is the rising student debt and the cost of borrowing to finance education, which are immediate concerns and are longer term concerns for younger cohorts as they work through the system. At the same time, there's the dream is that the better paying job, the job opportunities that open up will allow this to be paid off. Housing is another issue that's mentioned in that question. And there's no doubt, that the pressures on housing are increasing. I think one of the impacts of that may be, though, that there may be some, not migration away from education, but maybe looking at more opportunities in some of the smaller centers, some of the distance education, web-based learning programs, and others that COVID has also made possible. So I don't see the enrollment levels going down, but there's going to be intense pressure among institutions to attract and keep students.
Thank you. There's a little bit of a different question, and it's about the elite formation. So about people who are going elsewhere to get the elites who are going elsewhere to get the education, and how does this change, I guess, the composition of Canada, or the elite formation in Canada, which I think is quite interesting. And also the question was asking if there's any studies on this.
Yeah, I like that question. I can't really answer it. I think it's another one that really begs for research to look at that. There are people I know that are exploring some dimensions of this, but I think it's an under researched area. We tend to look at at people coming into Canada to study, not so much Canadians that are studying elsewhere. Of course, a lot of the elite, I'm living in a province where you have potash and uranium companies, for example, and a lot of there's a lot of controversies over the CEOs who not only are from the US, but they live in the US and they just commute in for meetings and so on. So it's not in some of these cases, the elite are not the corporate structure is such that they're not just within Canada. It's a global, we intersect with the global elite structure in that way. But there still, of course, is some of this. I'm just trying to think even anecdotally about some of the cases where this might be prevalent. But no, I like the question, but I just can't do justice to respond to it.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by the question as well. Another question that I had was about your return on education. You were saying that immigrants tend to be more likely to be, well, have higher educational attainment, but their return on education tends to be less. And I was wondering if you could speak about just the overall return to education, who gets the most? I don't want to make it all about empirical returns, but like, who benefits most, and is it predicated on privilege or whiteness and gender and race? It seems like it would be, and I think we have studies that show that it is. But I was wondering if you could speak to that trend at all.
Yeah, it's very interesting. The recent literature that I've seen suggests that the return is not just on the level of education, but it's on the kind of programming. We all know that there's pressure on the humanities and social sciences to make our education more relevant for the job market, for example. At the same time, a lot of people are willing to accept lower wages for work that they might find more fulfilling than working in a soulless corporate environment or something like that. Canada's education system is slightly less, quite a bit less stratified than in the US, but it is still stratified both by institution and by program type. And so that's where you do see, I mean, in particular, the gender, as you mentioned, the gender returns are vary a lot, partly because of the streaming that takes place across different types of programs where women are more likely concentrated relative to those where men are more highly concentrated. For some groups, this is also true, for some immigrant groups and for some domestic groups as well. If you look at Indigenous students, they tend to be more highly concentrated in some areas than others as well. So there is, but this is where I say sort of this coexistence in my last near the end, where I talked about the coexistence of the old and the new inequality, where the intersections are very, 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 very strong, where there are, I was talking here at a high level, but of course, when you're talking about Indigenous students, you're not talking about a monolithic group. You're talking about a number of different communities and linguistic groups and status groups and socioeconomic groups, and that's true for immigrants, for women, for the disabled, for any other category that you might choose to look at. And so the intersections are there's some powerful dominant trends, but within that there's some very interesting nuances and differences.
Yeah, and as Jacqueline just pointed out, like some of the return on investment is also contingent upon the de-skilling that happens here, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a really good point as well. Earlier, I know we're running out of time. We have 2 minutes left. Miriam, I believe, had asked for the titles of the books that you had referred to, just as a resource. And I was wondering if there's any way to circulate that to the colleagues.
Probably the best way is if you just email me and I can pass those on, or drop a line on the CSA networking lounge or somewhere, and I can follow up with the specific details, because there may be some that you might be more interested, or some might be more interested than others. But just my name, Terry.Wotherspoon, if you can spell it, at usaskbehindme.ca.
That would be great. Thank you. So we have 1 more minute left. If anyone has any other questions, I have a lot. I can keep asking while the other answers come forward. One of the things that we talked about was the performative, what Sarah Ahmed calls the non-performatives of equity that are taken in, and it's kind of coupled with that. I also find, do you think there's any trends about when you were talking about how the returns of what degree you do, right? Like what kind of educational field do you go into? Do you think there's a push for for particular groups to go into particular fields, and not necessarily self-guided, but also that this institutional, racialized, gendered push for you to kind of go into certain field that tends to be not as, doesn't have the same return, I guess, for lack of a better word. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's some of that. I mean, again, that's an empirical question which can be addressed and is being addressed by a lot of different researchers looking at a lot of different areas. If you look at immigrants, for example, a lot of immigrants, of course, sacrifice their own credential devaluation by investing in the second generation and ensuring that they have a higher quality of education within the Canadian context. And so, if you look at the one slide, you look at the visible minority versus the Canadian-born Black population, you do see some differences, both in the level of education and non-high school completion, but also if you were to dig into it, in the kinds of programming that they were to pursue.
Thanks, Terry. I think that's our time. Any other lingering questions? If you have any, we're here. Otherwise, thank you so much. And thank you for everyone in attendance. I really appreciate it, and very enlightening as well. Thank you, Terry. I'll just hang back until if someone else has anything else to say, then we'll call it.
Thanks, everyone, for the great questions, too. And thanks, Irene. Wonderful.
I think.